excited to welcome Luann Roberts to Wonders of the Salish Sea. Luann is a lover of nudibranchs, and like, who isn't? And she's photographed and documented thousands of nudibranch observations through the practice of dock fowling, which could be your next favorite hobby. Luann currently lives in Seattle and is focusing now on building a community of citizen scientists around dock fowling and other marine-based activities. So after Luann's presentation, we'll have time for a few questions. Please enter these in the chat and our hosts will moderate. So thanks so much, Luann, for being here, and over to you.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here. So to get started, I wanted to give you a bit of background about myself and how I experience these marine organisms, the nudibranchs. I consider myself a citizen scientist. I did get my Master's of Arts in Biology a couple of years ago, but it is not my full-time job. I do this all as a personal hobby, and I don't do any sort of formal research. I'm not affiliated with any sort of institute. This is just kind of me going on my own, making observations. All the photos that you see tonight are my photos that I've taken, except for the ones with me in them. So to introduce the subject, I wanted to familiarize everybody with the practice of dock fowling. But before we start on dock fowling, I wanted to discuss a bit about tide pooling first. So tide pooling is the initial way that I started to experience the intertidal zone, the marine environment. And it's where I started to build a connection to the ocean. And when I was pursuing my Master's of Arts in Biology back in 2020, I really wanted to use tide pooling as a way to connect my community to the intertidal zone, to get them really excited about tide pooling and about the marine environment. So with that in mind, I booked off every low tide for the summer of 2020 and kind of traveled up and down the coast and took a lot of photos in tide pools and started sharing them with the online community, mostly on Instagram. I went to Crescent City tide pools, down to Duxbury Reef in California. I went to local places, to Deception Pass, and just started sharing these images with a lot of people. And I started to kind of integrate myself into that online community. And one thing about tide pooling is that when you see sea slugs or nudibranchs when you're tide pooling, they don't really look like anything special. They look like brightly little shiny snot piles that you wouldn't really be able to distinguish much from. They're in a state of distress when the water is receding during low tide, and they aren't really at their best. They can't really move around much. They are kind of shriveled up to try and protect themselves. But when you see them underwater, they look much different. These are the same species of nudibranch on the top. They're in their form during low tide, and then you see them underwater. And as I was integrating myself into this community of tide poolers, I noticed images of sea slugs that looked a lot more like what you see on the bottom than what you see on the top there. And I started asking questions like, how are people seeing these sea slugs in this way? Because they weren't going diving. What was this all about? And this term kept on coming up that I wasn't familiar with at all, which was dock fowling. And I had no idea what this meant, but I kept on seeing it in reference to these amazing nudibranch photos. So I Googled it and learned that dock fowling simply is the assemblages of marine organisms that grow on the underside of man-made structures that are in the water, such as floating docks. And these are considered foul because they often create harm or economic damage or a nuisance to the things that they attach to. They're typically unwanted. They often contain invasive species that are brought in by boats coming to marinas, and they're just kind of this odd mix of things that attach to man-made structures. And when I saw this in reference to nudibranchs, I still wasn't quite making the connection there. I didn't know what dock fouling meant in relation to sea slugs. So I reached out to one of the people who was posting these photos, and I learned that by laying flat on a floating dock, you can look over the edge and experience all of the same organisms that you would really see in a tide pool. And you don't see them in this kind of droopy, distressed state. You're seeing them more at their best, where they're in the water, they're in a more static environment. So you can really just take the time to lay down and take a look at them. So I met up with one of the people who was experiencing the marine environment in this way down in California during one of my tide pulling trips. And she showed me how to find sea slugs by looking over the side of floating docks. And without this knowledge, there's tons of really cool things that you can see just by looking over the edge. But you may or may not see a nudibranch, but chances are that you're going to need a little bit of help to find them, because they're very small and they can blend in. So without experience, you don't really get much out of it. So when I traveled down there and kind of learned the technique, I brought it back with me to Seattle and started exploring all around Puget Sound to any marina I could find available. I didn't know anybody else who was really doing this activity out here, so I really had to figure it out on my own. And the thing about docks is that the conditions can vary greatly. Here's one of my favorite docks where it's very uneven and half of it is more submerged in the water than it actually should be. But this is kind of what this activity looks like. This is another dock. I'm wearing some rubber pants here because often there's seal poop and bird poop all over the dock. So this helps keep me dry and clean while I'm looking for sea slugs. This is a group of us doing dock fouling. You can see that you can do it together with other people. You can do it together with other people and still kind of have it as a solo activity, and then yell out when you find something interesting and bring someone over. The thing about dock fouling is that it's not really an established hobby. So it's not going to have the same amount of gear that you could just go online and buy to get out there and participate. It's not like bird watching. But it's also not like scuba diving in the sense that you don't really need to have a lot of equipment that you need to monitor and test. You're not on a time limit. You can just kind of get out there with what you have. Any of you could go out to a floating dock and see the same kinds of things that I'm seeing without investing all this time and expense. The basic equipment that you kind of need to go out and do this activity, you really don't need anything at all. You can just lay down on a dock and start looking for things. But there's a few things that will make it a bit easier for you and make it a bit more comfortable. If you bring a towel, that gives you something to lay on so you aren't covered in as much debris that's left on the dock. You can bring a large or medium bowl with you. I only really recommend this to people who are experienced in appropriately handling marine organisms. The bowl is so that you can gently remove creatures and view them a bit more close up. But without knowing how to appropriately handle these creatures, I wouldn't recommend doing that. But a lot of you have this kind of experience, so it's good to have that with you if you're showing it to a lot of people. Smartphone really helps. Waterproof ones even better, but you can look up what you're seeing on your phone and try and identify it. If you're really getting into it, getting some knee pads is a great idea. You can also get a cheap underwater camera for a very small investment, or you can get a really excellent camera for about $500 that's going to do almost everything you'll want to do in terms of taking photos of nudibranchs or any other organisms that you see. These are some of the common models of camera. My personal choice is the Olympus TG6. It runs around $500. It has an underwater microscope mode. And speaking as somebody who's very harsh on their equipment and not very cautious about what they're doing all the time, this camera has served me very well. It holds up to a lot of different circumstances. But you might already have something that's appropriate for the job lying around. If you have a GoPro that's waterproof, that's something that you can dunk into the water, or you can use a waterproof phone. I don't have much experience with either of those, so I can't necessarily recommend it, but you can give it a try. I've seen people successful with those. Some advantages to experiencing the intertidal zone and these marine organisms through docks is that you can go any time of night or day. This is great for people like me who have full-time jobs that aren't doing anything marine related. You really don't have much expense to get started out with this. All you really need to do is get yourself to a floating dock. And you're observing these organisms in a mostly static environment, meaning that you can really just lay there and experience them and observe them without worrying about the tides coming back in or potential hazards that might be around you. For me, one of the great advantages is that you don't have to read the tide chart. Yes, the tides do affect to some extent what you might see at the docks, but for the most part, you're not going to need it. Some of the disadvantages to looking at marine organisms this way is that the docks are often gross. Seals like to lay on them. Sea lions like to go there. You have sea otters that will eat and leave all sorts of shell pieces, and the docks aren't made for people to lay on them, so they can have hazards like nails and splinters. People might look at you a bit funny because they don't know what you're doing. I've never had a bad time because of this, but it's just something that you might put you off. It can be physically challenging because you're getting up and down all the time. But if that's an issue for you, you can pick an interesting spot and just lay there. And with dock fouling, the conditions can be a little hard to predict because if there's a bit of a chop to the water or the right type of rain, you're not going to be able to see very much. Some things to consider if you're looking at the environment this way is that if you remove an organism from its food source, it might result in its death. So unless you have advanced knowledge of the creature that you're handling or what you're doing with it or what it might eat, then I would recommend not handling it. Definitely don't pry or remove anything from the dock itself that's stationary there, because that will almost definitely result in its death. Also consider that you should not violate no trespassing signs. You're in a place where people live. People often live on their boats. If they don't live there, it's a big investment for them. So be respectful and be aware that you might not be wanted in that area. And just be mindful of your surroundings. And that's not just for safety reasons, but also because there could be something really cool happening that if you don't lift your head up, you're going to miss. Harbor seals often like to watch me while I'm dock fouling, and I like to think that they're wondering why I'm laying on the dock and not them. So now we'll move on to the nudibranchs, what really has attracted me to this hobby and why I continue to do it on an almost weekly basis. These are all examples of different types of nudibranchs. They are shellless marine mollusks. And I'm just going to give a general overview of commonalities about all the different types of species, just to give us all a baseline knowledge of nudibranchs. They are all predators. They're They all kind of vary in size depending on species. They can be anywhere from about 1 or 2 millimeters to almost 20 centimeters, depending on the variety. And they can even vary in size within the species like that. These predators often eat other organisms that are sessile. So even though they're predators, you might not think of them as such because you won't see them in a very active predatory kind of behavior, but you definitely do for some species. One thing I wanted to touch upon is that you can refer to nudibranchs as sea slugs, and sea slugs is kind of this general overarching term for all the different kinds of nudibranchs and sea slugs that are out there. Nudibranchs are specifically the predatory sea slugs, and then you have other types of species that are referred to as sap sucking sea slugs, or like you have the pelagic sea slugs, which swim around, which are not nudibranchs. And I just wanted to throw that out there because when I refer to sea slugs, it refers to all the different varieties, not just the nudibranchs. But nudibranchs are specifically these types of creatures, the predatory ones. Now, how do I find the nudibranchs? Now, you might be really lucky, and there might be people who live in your area that are already kind of looking for sea slugs in this way, and they might not refer to this activity as dock fouling, but one way that you can find them is by going on to iNaturalist. And if you're not familiar with iNaturalist already, it's this wonderful website by Caltech Academy where you can upload your observations of any kind of organism, and the community and a bit of AI helps you narrow down what that creature is. And what's great about it is that you can just use it as a way to track down what you want to see. So when I started out dock fouling, there wasn't really anybody looking for nudibranchs from floating docks around Puget Sound that I could find anywhere. So logging onto iNaturalist, what I would do is search nudibranch, and you can do this with any species that you're trying to find, and then look around the area to see where people are observing them. And even though they aren't observing them from docks, just knowing that they're in that area can really guide you to the right location. And often what I'll do is pull up Google Earth and kind of compare those two images and see where are the sea slugs compared to where the floating docks are. And then once I've established they're kind of in the same area, I'll do a little bit more research about the dock that I'm trying to go to and make sure that it's publicly accessible. Sometimes this isn't obvious. You can look at the street view images, and if there's no locked gate, often it's a place you can go. Another good indicator is that if it's a city-owned dock or a boat ramp, then those are usually places that are totally fine. So this is kind of my methodology for finding new areas. Now, a little bit just about the basic anatomy of nudibranchs. On the left, we have the kind of like Eylid planned nudibranch shape. And this is a thick-horned nudibranch, Hermesenda Crassicornis, a species that was distinguished from Hermesenda opalescens a few years ago. The opalescens do not have the white lines going on their frilly bits, the serrata projecting from the back there. And you don't really find them in our area. I'm trying to focus today on slugs that any of you folks might see around Puget Sound, Salish Sea, about anywhere from like Oregon up to Vancouver. And so the basic body plan of these Eylid sea slugs is they have this elongated body, the foot's at the bottom, which they move about with. It's very muscular. They have serrata, which are these projections. I like to refer to them as their frilly bits. And they contain the digestive glands. And one of the prey that these sea slugs eat are anemones, which have the stinging cells in them. And a lot of nudibranch species with these serrata projections are able to, not only are they immune to these cells, which allows them to predate on the anemones, but they're able to harness these stinging cells and store them in their serrata, which they can later use for defense. They have oral tentacles projecting from the front, which we're not too certain the kind of function of these, but you can see them kind of feeling around with them when you observe them. So maybe they're for feeling around their environment and finding food. The rhinophores are the two projections that go straight up from its head, which are the sea slug's sensing organs. Also not too sure how these work. There isn't a lot of research done into these organs. On the right, you have another kind of classic body shape of a nudibranch. The Nanaimo Horndarid is a classic kind of dorid shape, the round sea slugs. And they have very similar body structure to the Eylids, but you can kind of see how it translates over, but they have a few different parts. Most notably, they have these beautiful anal gills that circle their anus that are used for respiration. And they have these kind of round, more flat bodies with all sorts of little bumpy projections from them, but these are not serrata. They also have the rhinophores at the front, which you would recognize, which also are used for sensing. But overall, they're a much different shape to the Eylids. So if you kind of have these two body shapes in mind, then this will really help you find most of the types of sea slugs that you would see on a floating dock. Now, to get more into the dorid body shape of nudibranchs, these are a few different examples of ones that I have frequently seen on floating docks. You can tell the commonalities between all 5 of these species, that they have these, the gills that are at the rear circling their anus. They have this bumpy exterior and generally a round body shape. Now, to give you some sense of the size difference between all these different species, the ridgetail dorid can be anywhere from about 2 millimeters to the max I'd seen is about 1 centimeter. The barnacle nudibranchs are about the same size, maybe a bit larger. And these are very difficult to find at first because they have really good camouflage. You can see that this one really blends in with its surroundings. So one great spot to look for these is on the pilings of floating docks, which really will require more of a low tide to go find, because as the tide recedes, the dock goes down and the piling is exposed. And on these pilings are barnacles, which is the food source for these barnacle nudibranchs. So that's a great spot to look for them. Monterey Doris, it's one of many yellow dorid sea slug species that you would see on the docks. These are a bit larger. I haven't seen them much smaller than 1 centimeter, and they'll grow as big as about the palm of my hand. And you don't see them as frequently on docks, but they do stand out and are a little easier to visually identify. The same with the leopard spotted dorid. Again, I'm not seeing these in very high numbers, but they're a lot larger. This individual would probably cover my entire hand, so they do stand out, but I only ever see 1 or 2 of them at the same time. I also have a fuzzy Encoders. I put that as an example to show you that between the fuzzy Encoders and the ridgetail dorid, when you're looking at both of these on a dock, then unless you have better eyesight than me, then you're probably not going to be able to really visually distinguish them. It's really afterwards when you've taken a photo and you can examine it that you can see the differences. Really, when you're out there looking at them, they just look like little dots. Here's some examples of Eylid nudibranchs, which are the elongated body plan sea slugs. These are ones that I quite often see at docks and rarely for tide pooling. The 3-lined Eylid is a very, very tiny nudibranch, which yesterday I even saw some individuals that were probably only 2 millimeter long, but they can grow up to be about a centimeter or two. And these, even though they're very small, they're a good way to start to tune your eye to find very small nudibranch species. They stand out quite a bit from the background. They are not as well camouflaged as many other species. So when you're looking at a substrate on a dock, then you might just see this little red moving glimmer, and that could be your three-lined Eylid or another similar species. The British Columbia Eylid is a bit of a different story. This one can be extremely hard to find. I did not see any of these species for the first year or so of going dock fowling. They're incredibly tiny. I think the largest I've seen was probably about 4 millimeter or so. And you find them in one very specific location, which is on the pink mouth hydroid that they eat. So there's a pair of them right here. From a distance, you might not even be able to distinguish them from the hydroid itself. On the bottom left, there's the thickhorn nudibranch again, Hermesenda Crassicornis. These I think of as really an iconic species for the Pacific Northwest because they are present year-round. You can see many individuals of these at once. About 2 weeks ago, I went to a dock where there was probably hundreds of visible organisms. And they're also a species that you might be familiar with from tide pooling. They can often be found in moon snail casings or just under crevices of rocks. This is one that, if you're familiar with it, you'll probably start to see fairly easily. White-crested Eylid is another example of a very tiny species that you almost have no hope of seeing at all unless you know what you're looking for. They are so small that you might mistake them for just a tiny fleck of shell. But when you start looking closer and adjusting your eye to seeing these creatures, you'll notice that that tiny speck has form and shape to it. And when you look at them really up close, it's amazing how detailed and beautiful these creatures are. Another really common nudibranch that most of you have likely seen is, now excuse all the names for it, Shaggy Mouse, common gray sea slug, shagrug nudibranch. I've heard even more names than that. There are actually 2 species of these that are pretty common in our area. And there's really not a good way of visually distinguishing them, except if you look at their rhinophores, the projections from the front of their head, you have to look at them very closely, and one species will have bumpy warts on its rhinophores and the other will not. Eylida papilosa is the one without the bumps, and Eylida louis is the one with the bumps. So a lot of the times I find that it's easier just to refer to these creatures by their common name because you can't really distinguish which species they are in the wild. So even though people might want to avoid using common names, they do have a really good place and usage with nudibranchs. Dirona nudibranchs are a large variety or larger variety of nudibranchs that aren't necessarily the most popular ones to find from docks, but they're so kind of relatively big and showy that you have a pretty good chance of seeing them. I especially see these more towards the Strait of Juan de Fuca around Deception Pass and less so around the city docks. Not quite sure why this occurs, but I've seen a lot more observations on docks like around Friday Harbor than I would like in Tacoma. And these are 2 common Dironas that we see out here. And golden dirona and the white line dirona have these beautiful kind of ballooning serrata that come off their backs. They're very visually appealing, very photogenic. And here's a few examples of some sea slugs that might be a bit difficult to see for a variety of reasons. Branched Dendronodus, Dendronodus venusis, it's very, very common when it's around, but when it's not around, you're not going to see any of them. Right now is a great time for branched Dendronodus. I would recommend getting out there if this is your favorite species. I could probably look at an 8-foot section of dock and point out a couple dozen of them, but they can be difficult to find. This one stands out a lot against this background, but a lot of these species are more cryptic and bushy and blend in with their surroundings. You have rainbow nudibranchs, which are very interesting because they start life off as these tiny little specks and grow up to be these giant swimming creatures that can get up to be about a foot long. These are a bit seasonal, and you can see the juveniles sometimes of year and then the adults other times a year. Eubrancus at the bottom left. This is a species which is a little tricky to nail down to a species level. And these are incredibly common. I can almost always find some sort of Eubrancus wherever I go, but they can be hard to see because they're so tiny and they blend in with their surroundings. Lion's mane nudibranchs, I don't see very often, but they're exclusively in the kelp, and it really takes a certain condition and time of year for the kelp to be just right. But when it is, then you can flip over a blade of kelp that's projecting from a dock, and you could potentially find several of these. Nanaimo Horndarids are a great tide pooling species that tend to show up like seasonally at the docks. And these are just kind of gorgeous and glittery. And if you start seeing them, you'll probably see them consistently for a few weeks. These are more examples of species that might be tricky to see for a variety of reasons. On the top left, I have a red-fingered Corifella. I haven't put it in a species category because this is a type of nudibranch that is currently kind of being worked out and distinguished. Humped Ancula is very common right now, hundreds of these that you could go out and see. The pink rose Casona is very tiny and difficult to find, but if you find some pink mouth hydroid and are persistent, then you might find one of these. These two on the bottom right are a bit odd in terms of what I would normally see on a dock, but I just wanted to throw them in there as examples of things that might pop up that you could train your brain to know that they might exist out there, but probably you're not going to see them unless you spend a very long time looking. These are an example of cryptic nudibranchs, which if you don't know to look for them, you will almost definitely not be able to find. They are Karambai, which there are two species that are common out here, the Pacific Karambai and Steinberg's Karambai. And they're just tiny little dorids that spend their whole life on the kelp-lace bryozoa. And you can see some of their eggs right below them there. So some non-Nudibranch sea slugs that I wanted to give examples for because they're kind of nudibranch adjacent and very fascinating. The Pacific batwing sea slug is this tiny little sea slug that's about the size of a jelly bean. And you can see it often floating around, flapping its tiny little wings around the docks, or you might find it resting in some sort of substrate on the side of a dock, just looking kind of small and glittery. And you might get lucky and see a naked sea butterfly, which is also referred to as a sea angel. I've only been able to see one of these once, and it was after the tsunami, so it was probably an anomaly. But just a reminder to keep your head up and keep looking. The Sap Sucking Sea Slugs, which are also not nudibranchs, you might find alongside nudibranchs, and they're different because they are not predators. Instead, they have a specialized tooth that will penetrate the cell wall of algae, and they suck out the cellular contents. And these have some of the species have this special ability to utilize the chloroplasts that they derive from the algae, and when they don't have a food source, they can actually use them for nourishment. You can see on the bottom right, the hedgepest sapsucker, which is a great example of this. It actually folds out its body when it's trying to use these cells for photosynthesis. It's pretty amazing. Now, I didn't mention before in my introduction about nudibranchs, but they are all hermaphrodites. So they can potentially mate with any other individual from their species, and they simultaneously mate with each other. They have their sex organs are just located right on below, next to their head on the right side, so they just kind of pull up alongside each other, and it doesn't really look like much of anything is happening, but they are indeed exchanging sperm packets. A great way to find nudibranchs is to look for their eggs. And here are some examples of nudibranchs with their eggs. Oftentimes you'll find just the eggs alone. Especially with species like the shagrugs or the barnacle nudibranchs, you'll often find these big, beautiful masses of eggs before you'll see any of the slugs themselves. Here's some more examples of sea slugs with eggs. The small egg mass of the red-fingered Chorophella, you probably will never see unless you are looking very hard for them. But with the Eubranchus, even though these egg masses are smaller than the slugs themselves, they are a really good way to find them because the Eubranchus like to live in hydroid clumps. So if you see a hydroid clump with all these tiny little white shapes in them, there's a good chance that you're going to find a Eubranchus. Another aspect to consider when you're looking for nudibranchs is that the same species might look very different depending on the stage of its life. This is all the same species, the Dendronodus venusis, and in the top left you see it just barely out of its larval stage. It's just barely a sea slug. It doesn't have much definition. It's very smooth. And then on the right, you have it in its more juvenile phase, where it has more definition to its body and it has more branching to its projections. And on the bottom left, you can see a full adult where it has many branches. It's very bushy, and it could be a little harder to find because of how cryptic it's become with its projections. Another great example is Dendronodosiris, which is the rainbow nudibranch. And they start out life looking, they have a very similar coloration, but if you look at their body shape, it looks quite different. On the bottom left, you can see a very young rainbow nudibranch next to some eggs. In the middle, it's in its more juvenile form. And on the right, that's a full adult. And it's quite a big difference in the shape and size of it. So when I first encountered this species, I thought they were actually different types of creatures because of how different they looked. And it wasn't until researching it further that I understood they were all rainbow nudibranchs. Another great way to look for nudibranchs is to try and find their food source. And if there's no food for nudibranchs around, you're not going to find them. Their lives are very closely connected to what they eat. And this is a 3-lined Eylid with one of its food sources, a pink-mouthed hydroid. This is the rose-pink Casona, which also eats a different species of pink-mouthed hydroid. And as the previous presenter was saying, there's not a lot of good information out there about hydroids and hydroid identification, but once you can visually identify like what a hydroid generally looks like, then that will help you get a long way in finding some sea slugs. Sea slugs and nudibranchs also can predate on anemones, and here's an image of a shagrug that is just chowing down on an anemone. You can see that the anemone tried shooting out some protective threads in defense, but it doesn't matter. That sea slug's just going to town on it. This is Monterey Doris predating on a yellow sea sponge. And this is a great example of a nudibranch that has the coloration from its food source, but this won't always be the case. Sometimes they will look almost exactly like their food, and sometimes they will stand out. Another really interesting quality to nudibranchs is their ability to take damage and regenerate. This is a red-fingered chorophella where you can see it looks a bit odd. It is missing many of its serrata, but it's also in the process of rebuilding them. And this creature seemed to be perfectly content going about the business of its life. So it's pretty amazing to me that these creatures have that kind of ability. Now, I wanted to touch upon how important dock fouling and citizen science is in making real contributions to scientific knowledge. This is a photo I took of a species called the Pacifia Amica, which is a little hard to say. And when I had taken this photo, there was only one other photo of it that anybody knew existed. So I posted it to iNaturalist, and I had the person who originally collected the specimen that defined the species confirm my observation along with some other experts. And my observation of it meant that they could extend the range of this creature by 25 miles, which isn't huge, but it's amazing to think that just by going out and looking consistently, just with a camera and myself, that I can contribute to science in a way like this, and that this is available to anybody who's persistent enough and keen enough on it is able to make a scientific contribution if they're dedicated enough. And just yesterday, I went back out and found the same species again at one of my regular locations, and I was able to get this image of it in the process of creating an egg ribbon, which potentially this is the only known documentation of this particular species and its eggs. So this could potentially be a significant contribution in terms of now we know what this creature's eggs look like. And we also have a pink mouth hydroid in the photo. And while I haven't actively seen it eating the hydroid, maybe next time I'll be able to capture an image of it eating its food source. So I really wanted to make that point that this is something that's available to anybody. I'm not anybody special. I don't have special training. I just go out on my own and am persistent and dedicated. And you could do the same thing and potentially make the same kind of contribution. But I also wanted to point out that even if you're not into sea slugs, there's many amazing things that you can see from the docks. There's a jellyfish swarm that I observed. A sea cucumber with a commensal scale worm was up on the piping at the side of the dock, and I found that to be amazing. And you can also see incredible events like this lion's mane jellyfish massacre, which a swarm of jellyfish were just going through the dock, and you could see that the anemones had captured, well, they probably just ran into the anemones. They aren't capturing them actively, but they're having a feast on them. That was something amazing to witness. And I'm just gonna leave this slide up here. This is wrapped up my presentation, and I'm ready for any questions anyone wants to throw at me.
Well, thanks so much, Luann. I think maybe we're all just a little stunned. Can you hear me? Because I seem to have an echo. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's just, for your presentation, for your sharing of this way of viewing wildlife that's so non-invasive and free and available to anyone, and your contribution to citizen science. So one thing I wanted to ask, that Joan said every now and then we see your fingers in the pictures. I know because I follow you on Instagram.
Yay.
That, you often use your fingers and to show the size of them, of the nudibranchs, because these nudibranchs are probably a lot smaller than people are thinking from the photographs. Could you say a little bit about that and the millimeters you have on your finger?
Sure. I'm assuming that you could probably see them a bit on the camera if you're looking at my webcam. When I started sharing these images with people, I started just by putting my finger in the photo, and I realized that wasn't really enough in terms of being able to convey scale appropriately, because your finger just kind of turns into this alien object that's in the creature's environment instead of it actually being this kind of measuring device. So I got a scale tattooed on my hand, so that when I'm taking photos, it's right up next to the creature. I don't use it scientifically. It's my skin's gonna expand and contract. My hands swell up terribly when they're in the water for ages. So it's not a scientific measure, but it's more a communication piece so that people have a better understanding of the size of these creatures, because some of them are incredibly tiny.
And someone asked if you wear gloves in the water, or do you use a snorkel mask?
Oh my gosh. So I don't think the snorkel would bring me any sort of advantage, because instead of my face being like here away from it, it'll just be like here. And my camera's doing most of the work of seeing things for me. So it wouldn't help me in terms of being able to take better photos, I don't think. Although I'm open to the idea of somebody telling me how snorkeling might be an advantage. But sorry, what was the other part of the question? The snorkeling and what else was it?
Gloves.
Oh, gloves. So this is kind of a tough subject for me, because I've tried really hard to figure out a way of having gloves that don't hinder my manipulation of the camera. And I'm also handling, not directly, but I'm manipulating things that these incredibly tiny creatures are on. And I'm concerned that if I started wearing gloves, that I would accidentally do something to harm them, not really be able to feel what my hands are on. But I do run into this issue of you all know the water isn't very warm out here. So if I have my hand in the water for an extended period of time, the whole thing just goes numb. So that can make it difficult. But if anybody has any glove suggestions, I'd love to hear them. I've tried all sorts of different things.
How many pictures do you take on a typical outing?
So if I'm having a bad day, it'll be about 100. If I'm having a good day, then it's usually between 800 to 1,000.
I'll jump in here and just say there's lots of people who are loving the presentation and your methodology and your explanations, and someone's saying you are the most knowledgeable hobbyist I've ever met. Well done. Lots of pics which are great. Over to you, Deb.
Sure. Let's see now. Oh yeah, great question. Any tips on how to avoid dropping your camera in the water?
Oh my gosh. So you have to have an entire system for not dropping anything in the water, really. So what I do is I have a pouch that I keep everything in, and the only things that come out of that pouch are going to be my camera and any tools I'm using for dock fouling. And I just have a wrist strap, and that works for me. Other people I know will have one of those like floaty wrist straps, so even if they do drop it, then it's going to float. But really, it's just being careful and not getting so absorbed into something that you're going to drop something into the water.
With nudibranchs being found around commercial docks, are they susceptible to any kind of dockside pollution, such as hydrocarbons or human waste? Have you encountered any die-offs? Yeah.
So that's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure that there's necessarily been any research into that. Sea slugs are, well, nudibranchs are incredibly fickle in terms of they need a very specific set of circumstances in order to flourish. So once they hatch, they float around as larvae, and once they have their appropriate food source, they can become slugs and mate and lay their eggs, and they have very short lives. So what I'm trying to say is that it would be very hard to determine which factor specifically would be causing them to die off or not die off. A temperature fluctuation might cause it. It could be that somebody like came along and scraped the side of their boat on the dock. It's very hard to say in these kind of weird quasi man-made environments which factor influences their presence or absence, really.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew asked, how many species of sea slugs have you seen in fowling communities so far?
I want to put it at about 65 species that I've seen. Probably around 40 to 50 of those are in the Puget Sound area, and then I've seen a few additional species. I just recently went to Alaska and found a few different species on their docks, and I regularly go down to the Bay Area and they have a different set of species on their docks.
More accolades on your dedication, Luan. Fascinating human scale you pose. That's a fascinating human scale you pose. All hail the slug queen. Awesome, thank you. Definitely leaving this presentation with new eyes on nudibranchs.
So the last question, is there a typical lifespan for nudibranchs, which you might have talked about a little bit, but if you could address that again, maybe.
It varies quite a bit by species. As far as I'm aware, most species will only live for a few months. And then there's a few like the rainbow nudibranchs, which will live for a couple of years. Oh, and I did want to say that if anybody reaches out to me, please reach out to me on Instagram and I will take you out to the docks. It might take me a while to figure out a time, but I have a full-time job, but that offer is always there.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This is really finishing off the program with this sense of amazing awe and wonder, which of course is what the Wonders of the Salish Sea is all about. So we thank you so much. And we'd love to invite you up here sometime, Luann. We'll find some good docks for you.
Yes, please. I've been dying to get out there.
Great. Okay. Thank you all for being part of the series and just showing how big this community is of people who love the environment that we live in. And we hope to see you again. You will get one more newsletter from us, and the recordings of tonight's presentations will be up sometime this week on the Transition Salt Spring website. And you will probably get a feedback survey from us as well. Stay in touch, and we hope to see you again.